I'm going to turn on the recorder so that we can get this all recorded in the correct amount of time. And so people are going to be probably dribbling in. We have students from different time zones. So would you like to get started so that we have enough time?
Yeah, up to you. You're the
Okay.
boss around here.
Only for a minute after I introduce you, then you're going to be the boss. So let's start it off. So everyone, welcome. I'm Michael McCarthy, one of the instructors for the E5408 Harvard Innovation Blockchain class. And I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Roop Singh. And Roop, if you could share with us a little bit about your background, how you got into blockchain. And I know that you just started off with a new venture. If you could share that with us, and then the floor is yours. We're just happy to hear whatever insights you'd like to share with us. So
Wonderful.
welcome.
Well, thank you for having me again. So, just to share a quick background, I've been working at the intersection of business and technology for the last 14 years or so. In the last about 8 to 10 years, I focused on business process management, business transformation, change management, and things of that nature. And we had been following the evolution of the blockchain space, with related technologies, and the ecosystem that it comes with. And we thought that blockchain, in fact, is a very effective business process transformation technology. It delivers what we had been promising using other techniques in the past. So we pivoted completely into this space about a year ago in 2017. I run a strategic blockchain consulting firm called Intuit Factory, and I recently also co-founded a stealth startup in this space.
Excellent. So can you tell us a little bit about one of the issues that we have? I'd love you to respond to it. There seems to be a lot of hype around blockchain,
Mhm.
and I'm challenged in finding people who are actually really making money in the space. Can you share with us some of the low-hanging fruit? What are some really good, valid reasons to be in blockchain where people can actually make some money with it? Are there
Hmm.
some really clear examples?
Hmm. Interesting. So I agree with you that there is a lot of hype. Um, Most of the big media has covered it now. You know, you hear things about it on CNBC and Wall Street Journal and Forbes magazine. I think something like 3 covers of last year's Forbes magazine were on blockchain. If you are in connection with the Davos World Economic Forum, I've heard that last one that happened just now, 3 days of conversation was centered around blockchain. So it does give you a lot of hype, and I think the hype is genuine in terms of the potential it has. But I think we are at the, if you remember the Gartner hype cycle, we're at the top of that hype cycle, and there is in some quadrants some irrational exuberance in the market, if you will, and that's natural. That it happens with technology quite a bit. We've seen this similar kind of hype in AI about 8 years ago. IoT was the big buzzword about 5 years ago. So we're watching the same evolution take place. In terms of making money, that's an interesting way to put it. So I remember watching a talk by Guy Kawasaki. I don't know if you know that name.
I do.
And one of the things he said, I think it's in his book as well. He talks about make meaning and not money. So that's the philosophy we like to follow. There is a lot of things that we can change in the world. We can make the world a better place by making things simpler, faster, better for our consumers and for ourselves. And that's what blockchain allows us to do. So to me, making money is a byproduct of that endeavor. So talking about that specific applications, there's quite a few use cases that are being developed now, and they will follow their own evolution. Each use case, each vertical has sort of their own trajectory, be it healthcare or real estate or financial services. So I'll give you a couple of examples that you might appreciate. So in financial services, if you've heard of Ripple, which is essentially a blockchain network replacing the Swift network, uh, that's a very interesting use case that has a lot of adoption. If you will, I can show you a couple of slides that we recently presented at a financial services conference. Would that be okay? Michael, would that be okay? Okay, maybe you're on mute. Can you still hear me, guys?
I can hear you. Looks like Michael's video froze. So
Yeah, he might be disconnected.
yeah.
Anyways, so here are a few use cases in the financial services world. Can you see them?
Yes.
Okay. So Visa's developing a global B2B payments network. They piloted in 2017. R3 is a very interesting platform, and they have launched with some big names, and they already have a lot of partners, as you can see here. I love this company, Navarro. I don't know if you've talked about it before. It's a UK-based company, and they're credited with issuing the first bonds on a public blockchain that are essentially approved by the UK regulator, FCA. And they have, I mean, it's an incredible journey if you think about how we can take the current world securities and put them on the chain. And technically, that's a problem to solve that has been solved a few times before. The biggest innovation in the case of Navarro is that they have done it with a regulator. So the regulator now proves that this is not only a financial instrument in the UK, but also a legal instrument. We talked about Ripple, and if you see here, they have over 100 customers, most of which are banks, and 75 or more of them have deployed it commercially. What that means is that they're using the network, the Ripple network, to transfer payments cross-border, bank to bank, instead of the Swift network that we have been used to for, I guess, 40 years or so. Here's a couple of other interesting use cases. So Israel's largest bank is developing a real-time blockchain-enabled platform to do something really simple, which is submit documents. It's a very common use case. And if you extend that further to how many documents does the customer need to submit for all these services that we need, be it loans or mortgages or any kind of auto financing, even insurance. I mean, this can extend to multiple different verticals. And then the other one, which is related to identity, which I also think is a huge use case, and it'll be the sort of bedrock of our future society, having secure identity from a customer's point of view, and an identity that's self-sovereign, that the customer has the rights to and can revoke the rights whenever they choose to. That would be the bedrock for our future society. So this gives you a sense of a few use cases. I can go on and on. There's, the space is so fast developing, and blockchain being such a foundational technology, it spans multiple different areas. So let's just stop there and take a few questions.
So Abhishek, feel free to pop in. I have one for you, Roop. Who do you feel is furthest along with a actual blockchain use case where they're ready to roll, they're open for business, and everything's working great?
There's quite a few companies that are making revenue, if that's the question. So you can look at BitPay. It's a very successful blockchain payments service provider. It actually started in Atlanta, and they just recently closed another round of funding. If you look at Storage, which is also an Atlanta company, a decentralized storage company, very similar to Filecoin. Then you look at Ripple, we talked about, R3 we talked about, they have real customers right now. Ripple's been around, my guess is 4 years or maybe even 5. And they have decent bit of adoption. If you look at some interesting test cases, like you must have heard of putting spinach on the blockchain by IBM and Walmart, or the diamonds use case by Everledger. So those are some great provenance use cases. Does that fit the bill?
That fits the bill, yes. What's one of your favorites? Who do you like the best?
That's a tough question. The reason is, as I said, blockchain is such a foundational technology. It will have far-reaching impact on so many different application areas, so many different verticals, that it's hard to say which one is going to be the most impactful. I'll tell you what I have seen, and then we'll get to what I really like. So if you've been following the space, you would note that there are 3 areas that development has really happened. One is protocols, and the second is platforms, distinct from protocols, and then decentralized applications. So I think most of the work has happened in the area of protocols, and we are now, let's say since last year, we've started to hear a lot more about platforms. And by platforms, I mean development platforms that other people could develop on. And then the third is decentralized application, which is where the least amount of news has happened thus far, or let's say least amount of enterprise-ready, production-ready applications that exist. So having said that, protocols is one area that will have the farthest reaching impact in a way, because it fundamentally changes the way we interact between different nodes. Platforms is the farthest impact in terms of business models. So if you think of any supply chain where there are a number of intermediaries, those are being essentially replaced by a consensus mechanism on a certain platform. And a lot of consulting firms and product firms are now getting into development of such platforms. And I think that's a next wave that will be ushered. All the major enterprise software players like Oracle, SAP, IBM are into the platform space already. So that's, if you thought that there was one SAP and one Oracle in the past, there's going to be 10 SAPs and 20 different types of platform players in this space. And then we'll see what gets consolidated and who eventually comes out to be as the de facto platform. I'll tell you what I like. I like the cases where there is a fundamental transformative shift. So I like a lot of identity use cases. And specifically in there, if you look at Uport and Sovereign, those are 2 of my favorites. I really like their architecture, followed closely by Civic, which I think is a limited use case, but still a step ahead of the current state of the world that we live in. In terms of applications, I certainly like Nomoro. I think they have an incredible, let's put it this way, they have single-handedly changed the class of assets that could be put on the blockchain and can now be regulated. And they're now helping other investment banks to move into that direction.
Mm-hmm.
So those are a few that come to mind. If you look on the consumer side, you'll find very common supply chain cases, like, the ability to track your fish or your wine or diamonds. So those are interesting, but it yet remains to be seen what is the consumer level impact and what is the consumer level adoption for those.
Mm-hmm. We just actually did a MIT hackathon with one of the people from Civic on identity.
Yeah.
And one of our initial projects was trying to help identify refugees in camps so that they could basically get out of the camps faster by identifying that, yes, you do have this diploma, this is your bank account, et cetera, et cetera. Can you share with us some of your favorite ways to identify people? Because we kind of went the whole gamut with different ways to identify people. And I'm curious if you had any any favorites that seem to be bubbling up over all the different ways to do it.
So if you think of identity as a problem, it's a very difficult problem to solve. It's not as simplistic as one would imagine. The first step is to define what do you consider identity, right? Let's take you as an example. If we know your name, is that your identity? Or in the United States, there is a thing called social security number, which is not common in other parts of the world. Everybody has some kind of number, but it's not widely interoperable. So if I have your social security number, is that an identity? If I know your user behavior, is that an identity? If I know your degrees or the place you used to live at, is that an identity? So I think a common model, and I'm curious to know what you guys came up with, is to find multiple sources, to find a lot of different data points, and to correlate those into one single set of factors that we can now call as your identity. And then you go from a percentage of confidence basis and you say, okay, we are very confident that this is this person that he says he is, and these are the different attributes or factors or even different verifiable sources that we have found that attest to the fact that this is the person's identity. Does that sound like an approach you guys did?
We did end up landing on that it ended up being a constellation where we started with was, how can you identify someone when they have nothing in their pocket, so no smartphone? I'm curious what you think about using people's ears as identifiers, because one of our issues was, you always start with the thumbprint, but two things that we came up with as issues there were, if you were doing a lot of manual labor, that thumbprint may have been worn away. That was one issue. The other one that we ran into is that you could dirty the thumb reader, because now you're actually getting into contact with something. Mm-hmm. And there was the issue of spreading disease and having to clean it and false reads, that kind of thing. So we actually got really excited about ears. And ears are pretty good until you get older, and then they start to grow. And then they're a little bit different. But we're curious if there has been a consensus on what is a great way to identify someone, assume that they're unconscious, so without their cooperation necessarily, where they wouldn't be touching the reader. So we had like ears, eyes, teeth. The way you walk is something that we discovered. We know that one's probably not a really good idea in the real world, but it was interesting all the ways that you could identify someone if they weren't able to identify themselves. But has anyone been kind of like coalescing around a one way of doing it?
I don't think there is one way of doing it. I think there are a lot of people trying different approaches, and it's a combination of using data analytics and AI and then putting it on the chain as the attested proof. So I'll tell you one way that we have seen, and it's a little controversial, and it will go to the depth of what you were talking about. How about using your DNA as your identity?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, if our DNA is including some other markers, not just purely a DNA, but that's probably the strongest indicator of identity thus far. The question is, how do you acquire it? How do you ensure that it's attested securely and safely and with a proper protocol? And how do you ensure that it actually lands on the chain the first time in a safe and secure way? So if you could solve that problem, the indicator is strong enough or unique enough that it might work. I'm curious to know if ears could be such unique identifiers. On a large scale population, would we have these clusters forming of people with similar ears, and then it becomes more difficult to identify further down the cluster?
Well, for what we discovered, there's 9 points on an ear that it can be as unique or even more unique than a thumbprint. So it was actually a decent way to do it. The DNA one we came up with, but that came down to cost. So we were thinking, you could do I guess the most non-invasive way would be a Q-tip into the inner lining of the cheek, but then there's the expense of doing the testing.
Mm-hmm.
And so we didn't even get to the point of what you were talking about. We didn't really get past step one with,
Mm-hmm.
oh, who's going to have the swab and who's going to have the testing material and what's that going to cost?
Yeah, and that's definitely so. In any one of these proof of identity, or you can even call it proof of ownership of an asset use cases, one of the biggest challenges to solve is how do you attest to it in the first instance? We know how to do it after the first instance has been put on the chain, and that is an easily technically solved problem. The more practical problem is how do you get to that first instance where we trust in the veracity of that data, and that this is actually the true asset. So let's take an even more random example, a painting. I have a painting here, let's say it's $1 million Van Gogh painting. Well, how do we know that? There are ways to attest it, and I'm sure there are a few experts in the world that would do it for a cost. But that practical aspect of putting this on the chain, once that's done, then we can create a digital asset out of it and do so many other things with it. But we still have to solve for the first instance. So I understand the problem space that you're dealing with.
We actually hit an even bigger problem.
Mm-hmm.
It was really funny. It seemed like such a good idea in the beginning, and then we just found all these practical reasons why it was just a nightmare thing to try to solve. And God bless whoever can figure it out. The one thing that we really couldn't get past was incentivizing. Like, for example, we have Patrick in the room and Abhishek, and we could say, hey, you might end up in a refugee camp. We'd love to get all of your identifying things on the blockchain so that we could get you out of that camp.
Mm-hmm.
And two things popped up. One is, what's going to incentivize Patrick and Abhishek to put all their information on the blockchain now,
Mm-hmm.
while they're sitting in the comfort of their own home? We're not in a war zone. No one ever plans to go to a refugee camp. No one ever plans to become homeless tomorrow because you had a house fire or a flood. And we couldn't figure out how we're going to incentivize people to move now, to put your information on the blockchain for safety purposes. That was one of the first ones.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also had the issue of, how are you going to identify yourself if you have forgotten, let's say, your passwords?
Mm-hmm.
And we started to get a little bit closer with that with, okay, well, there are certain things, because we actually had a guy that is doing identity for the country of Canada. I don't think it was one of these companies that you mentioned. Civic was there, but it Secure ID, I think that, what?
Sovereign is, I believe, a Canadian company.
I think it was called Secure ID.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them too.
Okay. They might be related to Sovereign. I'm sure there's a lot of names in the space. But they were talking about the constellations that you had mentioned where, for example, let's say it's me, no matter what bad shape I'm in or I have nothing, I'm always going to remember my name. I'll always remember my birth date. I'll always remember where I was born, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they were going to try to piece that together with, okay, if I've passed that first mini hurdle, then they might not tell me what my recent credit card transactions were, but say, hey, where did you spend $1.35 yesterday?
Mm.
And I would have to answer, well, I didn't, because I didn't have my card. Or, oh yeah, I bought a cup of coffee at Starbucks. So that was something where they kind of like throw out these little clues without actually giving you information that you could use otherwise. So you don't necessarily know if they really are acknowledging that I spent $1.35 on my credit card. It's like one of those things where it says, what 3 addresses have you lived at? And maybe none of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that was,
yeah, go ahead.
so that was just kind of how they were building the constellation, where they'd say, okay, you've answered enough of these right, where we actually will start to believe you.
Yeah. So that approach, actually banks use that today. Or the banks that have a lot of investment in security and are more innovative use that today. So I can think of a couple of examples of similar approaches. What I'm reminded of with that question and the underlying premise is this. This is an anecdote I heard. So back in the 90s, some reporter asked Jeff Bezos of Amazon, which was not such a behemoth that it is today at that time, the question was, how are you going to get people to sign up for the internet? And Jeff Bezos' answer was, I'm not. I am just going to create the best bookstore on the internet, and when they're ready and on there, they will find my bookstore. So a lot of these questions that we are dealing with in terms of real world adoption and ecosystem incentives and practical use cases around blockchain are sort of at that stage of the discussion. Some of the things that we hear, we get companies to talk to us, the startup companies all the time, and some of the use cases seem very esoteric. They're just too early for that time and place in our consumer society, in our lexicon, in our landscape that we live in, that we're just not there yet. Now, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't develop applications or use cases. When we get there, it'll be ready. So I think that addresses one of the basic fundamental issues that we find when we hear about a lot of the potential of blockchain technology, but not enough, use cases that are making money. The other aspect is, you mentioned incentives, and that's an excellent one. So when we have companies talk to us, be it incumbent companies or even startup ventures, one of the things that people miss most of the time is this idea of ecosystem design and ecosystem incentives. You'll find two categories of projects coming through. One is you'll have a very advanced, very grounded technical team that is fascinated with technology and can do wonders with it. And then you'll have the other kind, which are more business savvy folks, can see a real world application, but not as strong on the technical end of implementation of that use case. In both of those cases, this idea of what is the ecosystem, who are the different players in the ecosystem? Is it a network? What are the different sides of a network? Is it an environment where one set of the network has to come on your platform to have the other set of the network be incentivized? Or is it a case where you have multiple parties in the ecosystem that all have to adapt and adopt your particular platform or protocol for the end consumer to gain the benefit of it? So these are the pieces that people miss, and I'm glad that you brought that up. And this is part of our essential approach to what we call blockchain solution design, without which, my thinking is, even a superior technology sitting in a lab, not adopted technology, is not worth anything. Only an adopted technology is worth something. So we have to address the ecosystem incentive question for that to ever happen.
Well, on that point, I did a supply chain lecture last week,
Mm-hmm.
and one of our students has a blockchain in supply chain for real in the real
Mm-hmm.
world, and they sent us a note that they're having problems with their stakeholders,
Mm-hmm.
meaning the majority of them don't want to go on to the blockchain. They don't want to participate on it. And I'm curious, have you run into that? What is the objection, and are there any solutions around that objection?
Yeah, so that's a very common objection. And my guess is it's coming from, let's call them incumbent and entrenched ecosystem partners or competitors in the space. So think about it this way. I'm trying to think about this documentary I listened to a while ago. I think it was, don't count me on the date, but maybe let's say about 1,000 years ago. We moved from this idea of coins, of gold and bronze coins, to paper-based money. There was some emperor in Asia, I can't remember now where, that by decree said, I will take all your silver coins and I will issue you this paper, and in my kingdom, everybody shall value this paper as equivalent to this many silver coins. And that was a huge transition. We probably took years to go from there to here, right? And then in between, we had this transition from paper-based money today, about, my guess is about 30 years ago, into plastic form of digital currency called credit cards and debit cards and things of that nature. So we're going through a similar phase of transition. And if you could only imagine the entire ecosystem, the set of business processes, the set of systems that have been developed on the previous model, and to shake that out and to say we can now jump forward and leapfrog into a new model, there's going to be a lot of challenges in adoption. The incumbents will resist, and they will resist, this is my opinion, till they will find, till they have developed their own platforms and they will claim that this is the best way of doing things, and which is happening already in some use cases. The other aspect is, the question I would ask the student is, it is not important what is the underlying technology. It could be blockchain, it could be hash graphs, it could be, I don't care what is under the hood. What is the incentive and what is the bottom line benefit for the stakeholder to be on your network? Can they do things simpler, faster, better? Can they reduce cost or expand growth? If you answer these 5 factors, you might find incentives where you can get them to adopt because of some reason. So let's take the example of Ripple. They claim that their transaction settlement time, payment settlement time today is 4 seconds. That's what they claim on their website. And let's say they're talking to a bank, and today a check takes 3 to 4, maybe 5 days to clear sometimes, depending on what part of the world you're in. And if I told you, well, I will reduce your payment settlement time from 4 days to 4 seconds. Do you want this? I think you'll get some attention.
If I'm not playing the float, sure. If I'm playing the float, I don't want this at all.
Right, and that depends on your interest, right? So if you're playing the float, you have entrenched interest in the 4 days. Versus, let's look at what can you offer to your consumers, right? If you have that set of consumer base that would appreciate that level of transaction time, you're more incentivized to go that route, right? So these are the things that eventually will get the movement from, let's call it the old paradigm, the old world into the new world. And it's not going to be, it's not a short-term thing. So if you know of, what is that called? Amara's law, that we overestimate technology-driven adoption in the short term, but underestimate in the long term. So if you expected this to happen in 2 to 3 years, I don't think that's the case. But in the long term, the trajectory points to that direction regardless.
Well, what's interesting about what you say is, traditionally, it's the little startups are the ones that just run circles around the larger companies because they can. And blockchain has just had, to a lot of people's surprise, a lot of money going in from these larger firms, and everyone's worried, oh, they're gonna eat everyone's lunch. But to your point, what I think seems interesting is a lot of these bigger ones already have money in existing systems, and I think that leaves some room for these little guys and women who have these startups to run circles around them, and then once they become a threat, then they either get bought out or the bigger people copy them, and to your point, say, oh, look what we just invented, isn't this great?
Yeah, exactly. So this is a piece that we study quite often. Why is it so difficult for incumbent companies to innovate? And this is just one example of great work by Christensen Clayton, excuse me. There's quite a few different ways to approach disruption. The idea still remains, what do the incumbents do, right? Or what they don't do. So one of the things I talked about recently, and I'm sure you guys have heard this story before, at one point of time, Netflix and Blockbuster looked at the exact same macro level data in terms of changes in technology and adoption of technology by consumers, and the exact same consumer behavior data. But they came out with different conclusions, and the rest is history. One decided to go one route, and the other said, this is not that interesting. We don't think consumers will evolve, right? And these are the discussions we have with incumbents today. They say, oh, this is interesting. And the question that usually comes up in the boardroom is, well, why should I do it, right? What is my driver? So there are two main drivers. One is there is a direct competitor that is not only talking about developing a technology, but already has developed one. And it is to a level of quality of service that either compares with yours or is better than yours. And they already see signs of adoption or have gotten a decent level of user base already. That gets the incumbent companies' ears quicker than anything else. If there's a threat on the door, they will respond. The other side of that equation is if they are living in a business which is, let's call it for lack of a better term, cash cow business, and they have their set margins, the entire business process is the way we've done things for years, but they know from trends that that is not sustainable for any more longer period of time, 5 years or more. They see a decline in that cash cow. So they are now challenged to grow. They're challenged to find new ways to introduce products or enter new markets, or even more strategic, create new verticals. And that is a driver that would drive more strategic minded, more innovative style incumbents. But sometimes that does not happen. They choose to ignore those signs, and the rest is history. So let me show you a way that we use to explain that. So take a look at this. So the question for incumbents is, are you surviving disruption or are you creating disruption? So you can be quite tactical in your approach and say, okay, blockchain can replace old technology stack, reduce technical debt, and maybe make your processes that are tethered to the database-driven old school legacy systems much faster and more efficient. Or on the strategic end, you can look at, can it reconfigure your partner relationship across supply chain, or can it enable growth and allow you to enter new markets and create new markets for that matter and redraw verticals. So this is the extent of this foundational evolution that blockchain is bringing. Question is, which one do you choose to do? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have a slide or some guidelines on just saying to anyone in general, what are some questions you should ask to see whether or not you need a blockchain? I know that you can want a blockchain. It could be a nice to have. You could do a lot of things on it. But do you have
Absolutely,
like a short list of questions of, this is where you need to have blockchain?
Absolutely. So let's look through this. And we may have talked about this before, but it's good to do a very quick review. So when does blockchain make sense? Here are the top 8 reasons, and I'll run through them quickly because I think your students are very aware of these already. Number 8, where you need authenticity that can be gained by having immutable records where auditability is given and you have a provenance of an asset, where it came from and how it was transported and how it moved through the chain, even if it is a pure digital asset. Number 7, where you can move from a centralized model, and this is 2 dimensions here, centralized in terms of your storage, in terms of where the data is actually stored, into a decentralized model that allows you to have not a single point of failure and not a single point of compromise. And also in another dimension, centralized from a standpoint of authority. Who owns this particular data or database, which is the world that we live in today, versus getting into a decentralized environment where number of different parties share a set of resources, a set of infrastructure called a blockchain, where the trust is now in the chain and not purely in each party's centralized authority database. Number 6, disintermediation, where you can cut out the middleman that is not adding value. A very well discussed application of blockchain, where you can establish proof of ownership quickly and in a way that we all can trust that this is the real ownership. Typical example is ownership of land title, and especially in developing countries. And I think we talked about this in our last discussion as well, where that process of establishing the ownership on a house or a land, especially if you were given that in ancestry, your grandfather had it from their grandfather and further down the chain. So how do you actually ensure that you are the correct owner of the asset and nobody else can claim it? Proof of authorship, where you can attest that this is my creation, be it a song, be it a video, be it even an article, be it a book, be it a photo, where we can give a proof of authorship to the original creator, and we don't have to go through centralized intermediaries to establish that, like a record label. Automation, we just talked about it, wherein blockchain, to me, is a built-in business process automation paradigm. It cuts through a lot of the business process inefficiencies that are inherent in the database-driven incumbent world that we live in. Transparency, which essentially leads to transparency and trust in an automated world. So that's the 8 set of principles I would apply to see if blockchain really is required and can be an effective use case. And here are a few questions, if I can find that slide. Here are a few very detailed, direct questions that I would ask. And it could depend on who you are and how you address these questions. I'll let you guys absorb that for a minute. So answers to these questions would lead you to address which use cases are the most suitable for your blockchain. And then you could take it to the next level where you talk about the business models associated with such use cases. And that should eventually lead you down a path to say, well, of the 5 use cases we could come up with, these are the 2, or maybe even a single one, that seems the most relevant, most effective, and most opportune for us to launch a proof of concept or a project using blockchain in that use case.
This actually, it does. This actually generates a question that's non-business related, and that will be collaboration on scientific projects. Do you hear about people using blockchain for that?
I have not much. And that could be just my limited knowledge.
I was just kind of thinking, for example, let's say that all 4 of us in the room, that we're all scientists in different parts of the world, and we're trying to collaborate on some kind of study. Maybe I'm trying to get a pharmaceutical drug passed through the FDA, and maybe you're in a country where doing human trials, there aren't a lot of laws around it, and we basically try to put all the data on the blockchain to go to the FDA and say, hey, the drug is safe. We tried it out in this country. Why don't you? Would you look at would you be able to use that data to approve our drug in the U.S. even though we didn't do the trial in the U.S.? Something like that.
Yeah, definitely. So it reminds me of two different things. So about 8, maybe 10 years ago, I was involved in research using AI in the one of the biomedical fields. And the data set that we chose was this type of experiment called the microarray experiment. It's quite an experiment, quite expensive experiment to run. And it turned out that I think in the United States, there were basically 5 databases that could store this. One of them was at Stanford, and all these research institutions that have invested the time and money for it. And the challenge was that all of these agencies or institutions that stored this data recorded the data differently, although they were all microarray experiments. The process of arriving to validate or verify the data was different. And none of the 5 sources actually ever talked to each other. So the business use case there was, we have spent so much money in doing these experiments and arriving at this set of data, which we've stored at one place. But if a researcher at another place, in another country, in fact, wanted to utilize that data so that they don't have to do this experiment over and over again and spend the cost, effort, time, and energy, and can actually extend the research, taking the data from where it is, there was no provision for that to happen. So the idea to apply blockchain there would be, and now we're getting into a more global use case of blockchain, which I think is a very fascinating field, and some people have started to talk about it already, is the idea of blockchain of data. So essentially, if I could put, in my previous example, all the 5 data sources, and I could reconcile them somehow and come up with one set of veracity of data and one version of the truth, which is an important problem to solve by itself. And after that, I could put it on the chain. That could then be interoperable. We could access it from multiple places, depending on your access rights, of course. Not everybody would be welcome to join, but we could devise a governance mechanism that allows us to share that data in a practical way. I think that would, if you really think about it, that would increase the rate of innovation and the rate of scientific progress exponentially. Because one of the biggest challenges is how do we share data in a way that's secure, and it's in accordance with the law of the land, whatever land you're in. So one of the regulatory developments that's coming up is GDPR. I'm sure you're aware of that in Europe, and that essentially leads people into thinking about privacy and security of data, and more strongly about privacy and security of identity data and user generated or user behavior data. So we'll get to you in a second, Patrick. So the idea there is, if you look at today's, let's call it compromise of Facebook's data. I mean, we all use multiple of these social media channels where we generate the data. We put up pictures or words, or be it Instagram or LinkedIn or any one of these, Facebook. And then the business model that's related to that is companies take that data and sell it for sponsorship or add it to their valuation, which is a great way for them. But the question becomes, what happens to my data, right? And GDPR is one such regulation that will now enforce some of those guidelines. Blockchain-based platforms are a very effective way to solve for that, to solve for storing data in a way that we can all agree that this is the truth, and then we are only able to share the data when the user actually authorizes and gives access to it, right? And then we have a layer of encryption built in, wherein you could ensure that only people that are allowed to access it are the ones that are accessing it. So if you take a step back in all this stuff that I just said, the idea of big data being shared on blockchain is going to be fascinating. And I'm very excited to see where that technology goes. I mean, that's just a field that opens up so many different possibilities. Yes, Patrick.
Yeah. Sorry, actually, my question is not necessarily related to data privacy as such. But you just mentioned regulation, and I have a quick question about that. In a lot of sectors and industries, there are existing regulations across countries. And if you think of, for example, the financial services, heavily regulated with the SEC in the US. If you think of the healthcare sector, you have a lot of case studies that depend on the FDA being involved in supply chains. You have all sorts of customs also that come into play at the local and national level. So I think my question is, when you develop a blockchain application, blockchain-based application, and you have to make sure that you comply and abide by the local or federal regulations, it seems that it creates a framework where authorized participants only can be enabled. And this facilitates the creation of permissioned blockchains and private blockchains rather than public blockchain, when anybody can participate because the regulator needs to sort of vet them in the first place. And I've seen a lot of case studies where permissioned blockchains are reasonably successful at the proof of concept level, and public blockchains a bit harder to implement. And since private blockchains also sort of overcome that issue of participation that we mentioned before, because obviously within smaller niche, all the participants have an incentive to participate in the first place. Can we see going forward a multiplication of private and permissioned blockchains rather than multiplication of public blockchains? Is it something that you would think would be a consequence of these highly regulated industries that businesses operate within?
Excellent question. And I agree with your observation. Namely that if you start developing applications in this space, you will invariably find that you hit a bottleneck or a roadblock called regulation. So my opinion is that regulation lags 2 phases behind innovation. And you can apply that in all kinds of different technology spaces. So the other aspect to think about is most of the innovation and redrawing of the verticals and coming up with new verticals happens when you come at the intersection of current state of business processes and current state of regulation and new enablement through new technology. So to give you an example, let's go back, let's say 15 years ago, when there was no Uber. They came up with this, there were taxis, they came up with this app to connect the driver with the passenger, and a business model where drivers could drive independently, and they could share rides. So think about the time when it all started. There was no regulation to allow for such new model. You had to, and it would depend on, in fact, a city by city cases, or even state by state or country by country basis. You had to obtain a license for being a taxi service. If you take the city of New York, people used to spend thousands and even millions of dollars to get those taxi medallions. And those were the only people who could fly taxis on the road. So that was a big disruption of that market. And how did they do it? And they're in fact still in the middle of it. So they challenged that regulation. And they challenged that regulation city by city. If you look at Uber and the number of lawsuits that they have fought across the world, globally, my guess is it's over 200, where each city has their own set of constraints that you have to overcome. So one should expect that as a natural process of enabling or even disrupting and challenging a set of business models that would need to be changed. And typically those business models end up being protected by a moat of regulation around. You'll see similar phenomena in the financial services industry, right? So I would look at 2 things. One, you should accept that as a given challenge, right? That's something that you have to, if you're developing an application that would do that, you have to overcome. There's no other way around it. The other part is, the good news is, and I'll point you to the example we talked about a little while ago, Navarra, wherein there are regulators that understand that this is a massive innovation for the world. And this is a massive innovation for a leapfrog for human society. And there are regulators, and the companies that develop such innovation should have a positive stance to work with those regulators to help them understand the underlying pinnings of this technology, and to make them more comfortable with what it is and what potential it could have, and how it would be adopted, so that they work together with the regulator and issue things together. That's what they have done, and I hear of other cases across the world that's happening. Identity is one such case, where identity is a very strongly controlled government mechanism. If you think about it, there are countries where their regulators, you can talk about Switzerland or Estonia, where their regulators are coming together with blockchain companies to issue these new forms of identity. Right? So this kind of collaboration is a must, and it will happen more and more. There is no other way out of it. The other question that you ask, will we live in a world of private versus public blockchains? That's also a very interesting question. So one parallel you could draw is back to when internet started. For a lot of incumbents, if you go back to the middle 90s, one of the applications or use cases for the internet, which was not what it is today, it was not as understood or as applicable or as widespread as it is today, was to use it inside a company as a intra-network, right? That's where their first case of adoption started, in fact. And a lot of companies looked at, I have a brick and mortar business, and then I have to develop this e-business that is on this thing called the internet. We don't know if it's going to be successful. We don't know if people are going to be there. But these high-priced, stupid consultants are telling us to do it. So let's just throw a little bit of money and see what happens. Maybe we could get something out of it. That was their approach. And I think that's a similar mindset and a similar thought process we see today, right? You are getting interest from developing this, private, sort of secure, in between the supply chain partner, intranet, analogous blockchains. And that's a very valid use case. I'm not knocking it. I think depending on the use case, it's a very applicable, beneficial use case to do some things that we talked about, like reduce your transaction costs, increase your efficiency, and still stay on the same business model as you were before. The futuristic question is, will we live in a world of private blockchains or public blockchains? And my view is that we will have both. It will not be, I'll extend the question even further. Will we live in a world of multiple blockchains that are then being forked further? So do we live in a world of, let's say, 5 main blockchains, and then everything else is a fork of the previous one, right? And then we have a subset of private blockchains. So will that be the world? I think we will live in a world of multiple formats. So I've had these debates and sort of engaging passionate discussions with people who think that there would be one winner. I don't believe in that approach. I don't think that there will be one winner in terms of this is the overriding blockchain that will kill them all, and this will be the most superior one and everybody will be on it. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. What I do think will happen, that in each use case, you can take payments, you can take real estate, you can take loan origination, you can take supply chain tracking, you can take gaming, you can take all kinds of different platforms or development platforms. In all these different use cases, we will find de facto choices. We will find de facto leaders that will emerge, mostly not because of superior technology, which will be the beginning of the things, but mostly because of superior adoption. So let me just stop there. I have said a lot of things. So what's your response to that, Patrick?
No, yeah, that's fair. I think overall it's a very good response. In terms of yeah, I agree as well that in terms of the individual use cases, then perhaps we'd have winners and losers there. I think it also depends on the extent to which the use case has to travel across borders. I think about supply chains a lot because I'm quite interested in that area. And Michael always talks about what would happen in 20 years if blockchain is very successful. And in supply chains, you can imagine, of course, that perhaps one or two tracking mechanisms will succeed. And at the same time, when you think of the globalization of supply chains and how any given item nowadays can travel across multiple countries, you still sort of rely on having sort of widespread, electrification and technology transfer in a lot of places for this to happen. I mean, say, if you take a food item, for example, that can originate from remote places in developing countries and then transfer through other remote places in other developing countries, you still rely on having the ability from a technological and technical standpoint to have that blockchain implemented there, when at this time it's not necessarily very obvious or practical. So I think that we'll still need to make sure that this also happen in parallel to have mass adoption across a wide variety of countries to then have mass adoption of the various individual blockchains, right? Because if you think about United States or United Kingdom and developed countries, then it is easier, of course, to think about businesses implementing blockchains quite easily. But if I'm trying to track the origin of my chocolate bar and I have to rely on cocoa beans being properly tracked on the blockchain from, I don't know, Nicaragua or Western Africa, where these will originate. At this point, I don't find that this is necessarily obvious. And if at some point along the chain it is not done properly, doesn't that compromise the overall health of the system, right? So I think we still need to make sure that the technology is available. And this is not a blockchain specific problem, but it does require it, right?
Yeah, so I agree with your observation. Here's an interesting way to think about how blockchain can actually help. What blockchain will enable and is doing already is essentially leapfrogging of a lot of those communities and a lot of those regions. So there are regions that never went through, let's call it infrastructure development for the 30, 40 years that the developed world did. And as a result, they may not have roads, but they have a very effective, let's say, a telecom network, right? So it's almost a cognitive dissonance when you go to those countries and see that kind of evolution. It wasn't as planned. The advantage blockchain has is, let's say, if we are successfully able to implement those blockchain-based solution in those countries, what we will inherently do is leapfrog them from this legacy infrastructure that the developed countries are struggling to untether themselves from. And now you have these developing countries that actually would have leapfrogged and come to the latest and greatest in technology, and in some cases even ahead of a lot of these developed countries, right? So I can see examples of that. We were talking to a agro-tech company based out of India that already has quite a decently successful business without using blockchain in terms of connecting farmers and giving them the best prices for their produce at a very local sort of grassroots level. And they are looking to move into an application of blockchain. And I think for those kind of communities, regardless of what's under the hood, it's going to improve their efficiency even further. So if you use blockchain to do that, and if you can effectively track that produce, they can essentially let's take a simple example, which is actually applicable even in the developed world. If I can accurately track and attest a pound of produce as organic, that it originated in a farm that's been certified as organic, and each batch of this produce is actually organic by these set of parameters, and I can then put it on the chain, and that can be auditable by somebody who's looking to buy it, you will get much higher price for your produce, right? Rather than the non-organic one. The organic one gets more price because it sells for a better price at the grocery store. But there's no effective way to do that today. Now, let's say these farmers in India are able to do that. Imagine their level of economic development on a large scale that could be achieved. So that's an example of leapfrogging. So I'm very promised by, or very excited by the promise that this could bring in developing countries. Here's another approach to think of. I've talked to quite a few VCs and sort of influencers who are looking to develop, let's call it friendlier waters and friendlier regulatory climates for blockchain-based companies in developing countries. So without saying any names, you could imagine that if there are places where you could do business easily in this space, Puerto Rico is an example within the United States, and there's quite a few examples outside of the United States where blockchain-based or crypto-based, crypto asset-based companies are more excited and more incentivized to move to those areas. That itself is the job growth that it brings and the economic development that it brings is it by itself a great driver for this evolution.
Okay, guys,
Cool,
it's 3:12. I actually have another class to teach at 3:30, so I'm going to have to wrap this up. Roop, thank you so much for your insights. I could probably spend all day chatting about blockchain. It has so many multiple tentacles. But yeah, thank you so much for the generosity of your time and insights. And once I get the final tape of this, I'll put it up on YouTube and send you a copy.
Yeah, I'm very happy that we got this time, and I'm always excited to explore new nuances. We're always, this is such an interesting field that we are learning constantly. And there's so many amazing things that are coming up every day. I mean, just the possibilities are endless. So I'm glad that you're doing this course, and I hope the students are getting as much out of it as I'm getting talking about these things.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Roop, and we'll chat with you next time we have questions, and that'll probably be very soon.
Absolutely. Feel free to reach out.
Okay, take care.
Guys, you can connect with me on LinkedIn.
Sure.
Thank you, Roop.
Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you, bye.
Bye.